The sky was still the color of a fresh bruise when Clara's feet touched the cold wooden floorboards. It was a darkness she knew intimately, a quiet pact she kept with the land before the sun rose to bake it into submission. Out here, on the edge of nowhere, with the jagged teeth of the mountains serving as a constant, silent witness, sleep was a luxury paid for with aching muscles and a mind too weary to dream. She moved with the economy of motion born from endless repetition, stoking the embers in the wood stove, pumping a meager stream of water from the well that seemed to dig deeper into the earth's stingy heart each year, and scattering feed for the few scrawny chickens that pecked at the red dust. Her life was a litany of chores, a stark rhythm set against the vast, unforgiving silence of the West. The wind was a constant companion, a restless spirit that scoured the plains, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the fine, crimson dirt that settled in the lines of her face, in the folds of her calico dress, and on the windowsill of the small cabin she called home. It was a wind that promised no rain, only a slow, persistent wearing away of things. In the distance, the forlorn whinny of a neighbor's horse might break the stillness, a lonely sound that only amplified her own isolation. At night, the world shrank to the flickering circle of her lantern light, while beyond it, the coyotes would begin their yipping chorus, a wild, hungry song that made her pull the blanket tighter around her son's small shoulders. That son, Ben, was the quiet center of her world. At 7 years old, he had his father's serious eyes and a stillness that seemed too old for his small frame. He was her shadow as she worked, a silent partner in their shared struggle for survival on a homestead that felt more and more like a stubborn memory. This was Thomas's land, the place he had poured his sweat and hope into before a buffalo hunt had stolen him from them 3 years ago. The official report, delivered by a grim-faced sheriff who couldn't quite meet her eye, had called it a tragic accident, a stampede, a thrown horse, a fatal blow to the head. It was a story the land told often. Men went out to tame it and were swallowed whole. But in a town as small as theirs, whispers traveled faster than the telegraph. Whispers that said the scene was too clean, that Thomas, a man who knew horses and buffalo better than he knew the back of his own hand, would never have been caught so foolishly. The other men on the hunt had returned with their stories straight, their faces set like stone, but their eyes, when they thought no one was looking, held a flicker of something else, something that wasn't grief. Clara tried to push the thoughts away, to scrub them out of her mind like a stubborn stain, but they lingered, as persistent as the red dust. Her husband's cousin, Lucas, was a frequent visitor. He was a thick-set man, his presence as heavy and unavoidable as the summer heat. He would arrive unannounced, his hat in his large hands, offering to mend a fence post or check the roof for leaks. "Just looking out for kin," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. Clara would thank him, her words polite but cool, offering him a dipper of water she could ill afford to spare. She was grateful for the help. The work was too much for one woman and a small boy, but she was not grateful for the way he looked at her. His gaze was not one of familial concern. It was a heavy, possessive thing, an appraisal that lingered on her face, her hands, the curve of her neck, as if he were measuring her for a space in his own life. He saw a widow, a farm, an opportunity. He did not see her. On Sundays, Clara would harness their old mare to the buckboard and make the long, dusty ride into town for church. It was a duty she performed for Ben, a connection to a world of order and community she no longer felt a part of. She would sit in the back pew, her head bowed, feeling the weight of the town's eyes upon her. The looks were a mixture of pity, thick and suffocating, and a sharp, undisguised curiosity. She was too young, they thought, to be burdened with such sorrow. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was too rich, her frame too slender, her face, though etched with hardship, still too beautiful for the drab, shapeless uniform of widowhood. The women watched her with a wary sympathy, while some of the men watched her with the same assessing gaze as Lucas. She was a problem to be solved, a stray to be claimed. The preacher's words about faith and acceptance would wash over her, hollow sounds against the raw, practical truth of her existence. God might have his mysterious ways, but he wasn't the one hauling water at dawn or standing between a hungry wolf and a henhouse. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the vast sky in brutal shades of orange and purple, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was not an unusual sight, but this rider was different. He moved with a purpose that was immediately apparent. His silhouette and that of his horse, a beast as black as coal, cutting a sharp, undeniable figure against the bleeding sky. He did not slow as he approached the turnoff to her farm, guiding the horse onto the path with a quiet confidence that spoke of long, hard miles. Clara, who had been splitting firewood with a dogged determination, froze, her hand resting on the handle of the axe. Strangers were rarely good news. She watched as the man rode closer, his face obscured by the brim of a dusty black hat. He reined his horse to a halt a dozen yards from her, the animal stamping a hoof impatiently, its breath misting in the cooling air. The man swung himself down from the saddle in one fluid motion. He was tall and lean, his frame honed down to little more than bone and sinew, clad in dark, travel-worn clothes. He took off his hat, slapping it against his thigh to knock off a layer of dust, and, for the first time, she saw his face. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air rushed from her lungs, and the axe felt impossibly heavy in her hand. The face was older, harder, scorched by a sun more relentless than the one she knew. The lines around his eyes and mouth were carved deep, telling stories of a life she couldn't imagine. But the eyes themselves, she knew those eyes. They were Thomas's eyes. But where her husband's had held a steady, simple warmth, these were wells of a deep, shadowed sorrow. It was a sadness she remembered from a boy who had left 8 years ago, a boy who had looked at his older brother's new wife with a silent, aching reverence. But the boy was gone. In his place stood a man, rugged, still, and more handsome than she had any right to notice. "Elijah," she breathed, the name a ghost on her lips. He gave a slow, solemn nod. "Clara." His voice was deeper than she remembered, raspy with trail dust. For a long moment, they simply stood there, separated by 3 years of death and 8 years of distance. The silence was filled with everything that had gone unsaid between them, then and now. He was the ghost she had never expected to see again, the younger brother of her dead husband, returned from the wild borderlands of Mexico where he had gone to make his own way, away from the shadow of his brother. He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over the small, struggling farm, the patched roof of the cabin, and finally resting on her, taking in the worn dress and the calloused hands gripping the axe. "I heard about Thomas," he said, his tone flat, betraying no emotion. "The news travels slow where I've been." Clara could only nod, her throat tight. "I came to see the boy," he continued, his eyes glancing toward the cabin where Ben was. "And I came to understand what happened." A cold knot of apprehension formed in Clara's stomach. "It was an accident." The words sounded flimsy, even to her own ears. Elijah's gaze was piercing. "That's what the letter said." He didn't need to say more. The doubt hung in the air between them, as thick and tangible as the dust. He looked at her directly then, the banked sorrow in his eyes flaring for a moment with a hard, protective light. "I'd be obliged if you'd let me stay a few days. I want to pay my respects, and help out where I can. For Ben." Her mind reeled. To have him here, this man who was a living, breathing piece of her husband, was a complication she could not afford. It was improper. The town would talk even more than they already did. Lucas would see him as a rival, and worse, his presence would stir memories she fought every day to keep buried. Having him here would be like living with a ghost who was painfully, dangerously alive. She clutched the axe handle, her knuckles white. "This is a widow's house now. Elijah, It's just me and the boy." "I know what it is," he replied, his voice softening just a fraction. "He was my brother. That makes Ben my blood. Let me help, just for a little while." He did not press further, simply stood there under the vast, uncaring sky, a specter from a life she had tried to bury, waiting for an answer she did not know how to give. Elijah did not just stay. He melded into the harsh rhythm of the homestead as if he were born to it, the morning after his arrival. Clara awoke, not to silence, but to the steady, rhythmic thud of a hammer striking wood. She found him at the horse barn, his back to her, shirtless in the cool morning air. Muscles she never knew a man could possess moved with fluid efficiency under sun-darkened skin as he single-handedly reset a beam that had sagged for years. Thomas had always meant to fix it. He had talked about it often, over supper, planning the how and the when of it. But the when had never come. Elijah did not speak of it. He simply did it. Over the next few days, the farm began to breathe again under his care. He moved with a quiet, relentless energy that was both unnerving and deeply comforting. He rehung the gate that scraped against the dirt, patched the chicken coop, and then he began to dig. The old well had been failing, the water it yielded growing more sluggish and silty each season. Armed with a shovel and a pickaxe, Elijah started a new one, closer to the cottonwood grove where the ground was softer. He worked from sunup to sundown, his face set in a grim mask of concentration, the only sounds the scrape of his shovel and his own labored breaths. Clara would watch him from the cabin window, a pitcher of water in her hand, feeling a profound and unsettling gratitude. Thomas had been a good man, a gentle husband, but his dreams had always been bigger than his deeds. Elijah was the opposite. He was a man of few words and powerful, immediate action. He was mending the broken pieces of her life, and she didn't know how to feel about it. The nights were different. After Ben was asleep in his small cot, they would sit on opposite sides of the small hearth, the flickering firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls. A pot of weak coffee would simmer on the stove, and in the charged silence, the past would creep in. "He used to talk about you," Clara said one night, her voice barely a whisper. "He was proud of you, making your own way." Elijah stared into the flames, his profile hard and beautiful in the orange glow. He was the one everyone was proud of, stayed put, married the prettiest girl in the county, built a life. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a statement of fact. "This isn't much of a life," she confessed, gesturing to the sparse cabin. His eyes met hers across the fire. "It's more than some have. You're still here. You're raising his son. That's not nothing. Clara." They spoke of his time near the Mexican border, of the dust and the heat and the hard men he rode with. He spoke in clipped, spare sentences, but she could read the loneliness between the words. And they spoke of the time before he left, when he was just a lanky, quiet boy of 17. "You remember that barn dance, the year before you were married?" he asked, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Clara's heart gave a strange flutter. "I remember. You wouldn't dance with anyone." "I only wanted to dance with one person," he said softly, his gaze so direct, so full of an old, unspoken story, that she had to look away, her cheeks burning. He had loved her, even then, a boy's secret, hopeless crush on his brother's intended. They both knew it, though it had never been spoken aloud. To speak of it now, with Thomas's memory lying between them like a shroud, felt like a transgression. She began to watch him in secret moments. Once, late at night, she was woken by a strange noise, peeking through the curtain. She saw him still at the new well, working by the light of a full moon. The pale, silver light sculpted the planes of his body, turning the sweat on his skin to mercury. He stopped and straightened, arching his back, and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. In that unguarded moment, under the vast, silent watch of the moon, he was not her brother-in-law. He was just a man, beautiful and powerful and achingly alone. Her breath caught in her throat. Her gaze, which had been one of cautious gratitude, was changing. It was softening, warming, becoming something else entirely, something dangerous. A war began inside her. One part of her, the loyal widow, the grieving wife, was filled with a terrible, clawing guilt. This man was Thomas's blood. To look at him with anything other than familial affection was a betrayal of the highest order. It was a sin. But another part of her, a part she had thought long dead and buried, was stirring to life. It was the woman who was so tired of being strong, so weary of facing the howling wind and the predators in the night by herself. She craved the simple, profound feeling of being cared for, of being protected. Elijah's presence was a balm on a wound she hadn't even realized was still raw, and she hated herself for the relief she felt. The fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of Lucas. He rode up one afternoon on his sturdy roan, a proprietary air about him as he dismounted. He found Clara and Elijah near the barn, sharing a dipper of water. Elijah had just finished securing a new hinge on the main door, and Clara had laughed at a dry remark he'd made. It was a small, simple moment of shared work and easy companionship. Lucas stopped dead, his eyes taking in the scene. He saw the way Clara's face was lit with a smile he hadn't seen in 3 years. He saw the way Elijah stood close to her, his presence a shield. The genial mask Lucas usually wore slipped, revealing the raw jealousy beneath. "Clara," he said, his voice tight. His gaze shifted to Elijah, cold and assessing. "Didn't know you had company." "Lucas, you remember Thomas's brother, Elijah?" Clara said, her smile vanishing. The air grew thick with tension. "I remember," Lucas said, not offering a hand. "Heard you were back. Come to stir up trouble, have you?" "Come to look into my brother's affairs," Elijah replied, his voice level and cold. He didn't move, but his whole body seemed to tense, like a wolf scenting a rival. Lucas let out a short, humorless laugh. "His affairs are settled. We're taking care of our own." The way was pointed, meant to exclude Elijah and include himself with Clara. He looked at Clara then, his eyes full of suspicion and a dark, possessive anger that made her skin crawl. The visit was short and strained, and when Lucas finally rode away, he cast a long, venomous look back at the farm. His visit seemed to spur Elijah on. He began riding into town more often, spending hours at the saloon, not drinking, but listening. He spoke quietly with the 2 other men who had been on the hunt with Thomas. Clara saw him return one evening, his face a thundercloud. "What is it?" she asked, following him to the barn. "Jedediah," he said, referring to one of the hunters. "He's drinking himself into an early grave. He's scared. He said the tracks weren't right. Said a man's horse doesn't just get spooked by buffalo, it's been hunting all day. Not a horse like Thomas's." He slammed his fist against a post, the wood groaning in protest. "Something was out there, or someone. The scene was wrong. They're hiding something." The confirmation of her own dark fears sent a chill through her. The world suddenly felt sharper, more dangerous. The faceless whispers now had a focus, and that focus was terrifying. That night, she dreamt of it. She was lost on a vast, dark plain under a blood-red sky. A storm of buffalo thundered past, their hooves shaking the very ground. But she could not see them, only feel their terrible power. She was screaming Thomas's name, but the wind tore the sound from her lips. She saw a horse, riderless, its eyes wild with terror. Then she saw a man's boot, lying half buried in the dust. She woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright in her bed, her body slick with a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her door burst open. Elijah stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight from the open doorway, a figure of shadow and concern. He must have been sleeping on the porch. In 2 long strides, he was beside her bed. "Clara, are you all right?" She couldn't speak, only shake her head, caught in the dream's terrifying grip. He sat on the edge of the mattress and, without a word, pulled her into his arms. She collapsed against his chest, burying her face in the rough cotton of his shirt, and sobbed. She wept for Thomas, for her loneliness, for the crushing weight of her life. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, his presence solid and real in the terrifying darkness. He murmured quiet, soothing words, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He smelled of dust and leather and the clean scent of the night air. Slowly, her sobs subsided. She became aware of the hard strength of the arms around her, the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. She was wrapped in a warmth and safety she hadn't felt in years. She tilted her head back to look at him, to thank him. His face was inches from hers. The moonlight streaming through the window fell across his features, illuminating the deep sorrow in his eyes, a sorrow that now mingled with a different emotion, something raw and intense that mirrored the turmoil in her own heart. The space between them crackled. The world fell away. There was no past, no future, only this small, desperate moment in the dark. He lowered his head, his gaze fixed on her mouth. She saw his eyes flutter closed. Her own lips parted for a heartbeat. She leaned into him, her body craving the connection, the oblivion of a kiss. Then, the image of Thomas's kind, smiling face flashed in her mind. A wall of ice slammed down in her chest. No. The word was a choked gasp. She pushed against his chest, not with force, but with the full weight of her guilt. Elijah, stop! He froze, his eyes snapping open. They were filled with a dawning horror, as if he, too, were just waking from a trance. He pulled back as if he'd been burned. Clara scrambled to the far side of the bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin like a shield. You can't, she whispered, tears streaming down her face again, but for a different reason now. You're his brother. It's wrong. The dawn that followed was brittle and cold. The near kiss had shattered the fragile peace between them, and the silence it left behind was a heavy, suffocating thing. Elijah was up before her, already working at the far end of the property, his back a rigid line of condemnation. He was mending the longest stretch of fence, a task that would keep him far from the cabin, far from her. He did not come in for breakfast. Clara moved through her morning chores in a haze of shame and a strange, hollow ache. The warmth of his arms, the phantom touch of his lips, had been a brief, shocking flare of life in her numb existence. When she had pushed it away, she had expected to feel righteous, to feel the relief of a crisis averted. Instead, she just felt empty. The loneliness, which had been a dull, constant companion, was now sharp and piercing. That emptiness followed her into town a few days later for market day. The air was already thick with dust and the lowing of cattle. Usually, the bustle of the market was a welcome distraction, a brief immersion in the lives of others. But today was different. As she led Ben through the crowd, she felt a change in the atmosphere. The usual nods of greeting were hesitant, the smiles tight and fleeting. She saw women cluster together, their voices dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as she passed, their eyes following her with a new, harder glint. It was a look that went beyond pity. It was judgment. She stopped at Mrs. Gable's stall to buy flour. The stout baker's wife, who had once offered Clara a job out of sympathy, now busied herself arranging her loaves, refusing to meet Clara's eye. Just the flour today. Clara? She asked, her voice clipped and cool. Yes, please, Martha. The woman weighed the bag with brisk, unfriendly motions. As another customer approached, Mrs. Gable turned to her with a wide, warm smile. The message was clear. Clara was no longer just a poor widow to be pitied. She was a pariah. The chill of it was more profound than any winter wind. She saw Lucas then, standing across the square, talking with a group of ranchers. He caught her eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod, a smug look of satisfaction on his face. He was the source. He had taken the private, fragile world of her homestead and twisted it into a sordid public spectacle. He was poisoning the well of her reputation, ensuring she would have nowhere to turn but to him. Clara gathered Ben's hand in hers and fled the market, the stares of the townspeople feeling like stones thrown at her back. The weight of that public shaming settled heavily on her. But in the days that followed, Elijah seemed determined to build a small fortress of normalcy against it. He focused his attention on Ben. He began whittling a small horse for the boy in the evenings. And then one afternoon, he brought his own black stallion, saddled and ready, to the front of the cabin. "Time he learned," Elijah said simply. Ben's eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and excitement. Thomas had always been gentle, but perhaps too cautious. He had spoken of the day Ben would be old enough to ride, but that day, like the fence repair, had remained in the future. Elijah lifted the boy and set him in the saddle, his strong hands holding him steady. He walked the great horse in a slow circle, his voice a low, calming murmur as he explained how to hold the reins, how to feel the rhythm of the animal beneath him. Slowly, Ben's fear melted away. A tentative smile touched his lips, and then, as Elijah let the horse move into a slow trot, the boy's smile broke wide open. A laugh, pure and clear as a river stone, bubbled up from his small chest. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Clara, watching from the porch, felt something break inside her. The sound of her son's laughter was a beautiful, terrible thing. It was the sound Thomas should have been there to hear. Tears welled in her eyes and streamed down her face, hot and silent. They were tears of grief for her lost husband, tears of gratitude for the taciturn, handsome man who was teaching her son to be brave, and tears of confusion for the tangled, impossible mess her life had become. She loved the sound of that laughter, and she hated that Elijah was the one who had created it. Elijah's investigation, however, had not stopped. He was like a hound on a scent, quiet but relentless. One evening, he returned from town late, the smell of whiskey and stale smoke clinging to his clothes. His face was grim, but there was a new, dangerous light in his eyes. "I found Jedediah," he said, his voice low and tight. He sat at the table, running a hand over his tired face. "He was in the saloon, drunk enough to float a steamboat. I bought him a few more rounds." Clara's heart began to hammer. "What did he say?" "He talked about the hunt, about how strange it was. The other men were nervous, jumpy. He said Thomas rode ahead, chasing a small group of buffalo that had split from the herd." Elijah leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "Then he said something else. He said as they were riding to catch up, he saw another rider on the ridge, watching. He thought it was just another hunter at first, but when they found Thomas's body, the rider was gone." "Who was it?" Clara whispered, her hands clenched in her lap. He was too far to see clearly, but then, as Jedediah was telling the story, slurring his words, crying into his glass, he let it slip. He said they weren't the first ones to get to Thomas. Someone else was already there, standing over the body. A cold dread crept up Clara's spine. "Elijah? Who?" Elijah's voice dropped to a near whisper, full of venom. Lucas was there." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Suddenly, Lucas's constant presence, his possessive gaze, his spreading of rumors, it all clicked into place. It wasn't just opportunism. It was a campaign to isolate her, to claim what he believed was his. Clara felt sick. She looked at Elijah's face, at the cold fury in his eyes and the hard set of his jaw, and a new fear, sharper than any other, seized her. He wasn't just investigating. He was hunting. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to get the truth. He'll kill you," she breathed, the words tasting like ash. "Elijah, this is not your fight. You have to leave it be. He was my brother." The words exploded from him, a raw cry of pain and rage. "This is the only fight I have." She realized then the terrifying depth of his purpose. He would not stop until he had justice or a grave. She was afraid of losing him, of seeing another man she cared for swallowed by the violence of this land. A storm broke that night. It was a proper frontier deluge. the kind that turned the red dust to a thick, sucking mud. Rain lashed against the cabin, and thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations. Ben was asleep, but Clara was wide awake, her mind racing. She saw Elijah take a lantern and head out towards the barn, his shoulders hunched against the driving rain. A frantic terror seized her. She couldn't let him face Lucas. She couldn't bear another loss. Without thinking, she threw a shawl over her head and ran out into the storm, her bare feet sinking into the cold mud. She found him in the barn, the lantern casting a pool of golden light in the dusty darkness. He was checking the horses, his movements tense and agitated. The roar of the rain on the tin roof was deafening. "Elijah!" she cried, her voice thin against the storm. He turned, startled. "Clara, what are you doing out here? Get back inside. You have to stop this," she pleaded, her shawl soaked, her hair plastered to her face. "You can't go after him. It's what he wants. He'll be waiting for you." "I'm not afraid of him," he said, his jaw tight. "I am," she cried, her voice breaking. "I'm afraid for you. I can't bury someone else. I can't do it again." He stepped closer, his face softening in the lantern light. The fury was gone, replaced by the deep, familiar sorrow. "I'm not Thomas. I know," the words were a wail. "That's what makes it worse." They stood inches apart, the storm raging around them, their own private tempest raging between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, with guilt and desire, with fear and a terrible, magnetic pull. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping a raindrop from her cheek. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. And then the argument was over. The words were gone, burned away by a feeling that was too powerful to name. He lowered his head, and this time she did not pull away. His mouth found hers in a collision that was not gentle or tender, but desperate and ravenous. It was a kiss of shared grief and profound loneliness, a raw, frantic claiming in the heart of the storm. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, answering his hunger with her own. It was a whirlwind of sensation, a fierce, passionate release of all the tension that had been building for weeks. His hands moved from her face down her back, pressing her against him until she could feel the frantic beating of his heart. It was a moment of pure, unthinking surrender, a drowning in a feeling she had forgotten could exist. But as the kiss deepened, as the initial fire gave way to a deeper intimacy, the tears began to fall again, mingling with the rain on her face. This was not a beginning. It was an ending. It was a betrayal. She was kissing her husband's brother in the barn her husband had built. She finally broke away, breathless and trembling, her forehead resting against his chest. The passion receded, leaving behind a devastation that was colder and more complete than the loneliness that had come before. In the roaring darkness of the barn, with the thunder as her witness, she whispered the most painful truth of all, a penance and a prayer. "I still love him." He was gone. The morning broke clear and sharp, the air scrubbed clean by the storm. But the world felt fractured and wrong. Elijah's black stallion was missing from the barn, his saddle and gear gone from the post where they had hung. He had left in the pre-dawn darkness, a phantom slipping away as silently as he had arrived. On the rough-hewn table in the center of the cabin sat a single, folded piece of paper, a letter. Clara stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. Her hands, which had trembled all night, were now strangely still. Every instinct screamed at her to snatch it, to tear it open and devour the words inside. Did it hold an apology, a condemnation, a promise? But a deeper, colder instinct, one born of self-preservation, held her back. She could not bear to read it. If he had written words of affection, it would only deepen her sin. If he had written words of goodbye, it would make the hollow ache in her chest a permanent, gaping wound. The unread letter was a torment, but it was a torment of possibility. The truth, she feared, would be an execution. She left the letter on the table, a stark white rectangle in the dim light, and began the day's chores, moving like a woman made of glass. 2 days later, Lucas arrived. He had seen Elijah's horse was gone, and he came not with a pretense of neighborly help, but with the grim purpose of a businessman closing a deal. He found her by the well, hauling up a bucket of water, her movements leaden with exhaustion. "He's gone, then," Lucas stated, not a question. He dismounted and stood over her, blocking the sun. "Caused his trouble and ran off. Left you to face the music." Clara did not look at him. "There is no music, Lucas." "Oh, there is," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone that made her skin crawl. "People are talking. A man like that, staying in a widow's house. It ain't right. Your reputation is in tatters. Clara," he paused, letting the words sink in. "But I can fix it. I can help you." She finally looked at him, her eyes cold. "I don't need your help." "Everyone needs help," he pressed, taking a step closer. "Marry me. I'll give you my name. I'll make you an honest woman again. I'll raise the boy as my own. The talk will stop. I will make it stop." The offer was so audacious, so vile in its timing, that for a moment, Clara was speechless. He was offering to save her from a fire he himself had set. "No," she said, the word flat and hard. His face darkened. The thin veneer of concern vanished, revealing the raw ambition beneath. "You think you have a choice. You're alone. Your farm is failing. What will you do when winter comes? Who will protect you?" He leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. "I'll tell them all what I saw. I'll tell them about the nights he spent here. I'll paint a picture they won't ever forget." "You'll be less than nothing in this town." She recoiled from him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and disgust. "You belong with me," he hissed, his eyes burning with a strange, possessive light. "It should have been me from the start. I loved you before Thomas ever did. He just got in the way." The confession was a physical blow. It reframed years of his supposed kindness, twisting it into something predatory and obscene. Her revulsion gave her strength. "Get off my land, Lucas," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Get off my land, and don't you ever come back." For a moment, she thought he might strike her. Instead, a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "You'll change your mind," he promised. "When you're truly alone, you'll come begging." He turned and mounted his horse, leaving her trembling in the harsh sunlight, the world feeling even more precarious than before. The 3rd anniversary of Thomas's death arrived on a hot, windy day. It was a day Clara dreaded, a public performance of a grief that was now complicated and confused. The town gathered at the small cemetery on the hill, a collection of weathered wooden crosses overlooking the valley. Clara stood by the simple marker for Thomas, holding Ben's small, sweaty hand in hers. She felt the eyes of the community on her, their whispers carried on the wind. She was the subject of gossip, a woman of questionable morals, and she had never felt more alone. The preacher said his words about dust and ashes, but Clara heard nothing, her mind a numb buzz of shame and sorrow. As the crowd began to disperse, a figure appeared at the cemetery gate, a man on a black horse. A collective murmur went through the remaining townsfolk. It was Elijah. He had not run far. He had come back. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked not towards the grave, but directly towards her. The wind whipped at his dark coat, and the setting sun, a great bleeding ball of fire on the horizon, cast his long shadow before him. He ignored the shocked stares, the indignant gasps. His eyes, full of a fierce, desperate sorrow, were fixed only on her. He stopped a pace in front of her. The world seemed to fall silent, the only sound the keening of the wind. Lucas, who had been lingering nearby, froze, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. Then, in a gesture that seemed to belong to another time, another world, Elijah slowly went down on one knee in the red dust. He took her hand, the one not holding Ben's, in his own, Her hand was rough and calloused from work, but he held it as if it were the most precious thing he had ever touched. He bowed his head and pressed his lips to the back of her hand. It was not a kiss of passion, but of fealty, a solemn public declaration in the face of God and the entire town, at the very graveside of the man who stood between them. The shock that ripped through the crowd was a palpable thing. It was a collective intake of breath, a wave of pure, unadulterated scandal. This was not a private indiscretion whispered about behind closed doors. This was a flagrant, defiant act, thrown in the face of all decency. Clara took a reflexive step back, her mind reeling, but she did not pull her hand away. It rested in his, a strange point of stillness in a world that was spinning out of control. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of the man kneeling before her, but her gaze did not waver from his. In that moment, she was not thinking of right or wrong, of Thomas or the town. She was only aware of the profound, shattering truth of the gesture. He was not abandoning her. He was choosing her, whatever the cost. The spell was broken by a shrill voice. "Abomination!" It was Elspeth Miller, the oldest woman in the valley, her face a knot of righteous fury. She pointed a trembling finger at them. "In the sight of God, at her husband's grave, it is a sin against nature." Her cry was the spark that lit the kindling of the crowd's indignation. A low growl of agreement rumbled through the people. The women who had looked at her with pity now looked at her with contempt. The men who had looked at her with interest now looked at her with scorn. They were no longer a grieving widow and a long-lost brother. They were sinners, flaunting their shame for all to see. Ben, who had been watching the scene with a child's silent confusion, was suddenly accosted by a group of older boys. "Your ma's sweet on your uncle," one of them jeered, shoving him. "That ain't your uncle. That's your new PA," another taunted. Ben stumbled back, his face crumpling. The public scorn suddenly made personal and cruel. Clara snatched him back, pulling him into her skirts, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She looked at Elijah, who was now on his feet, his face a mask of stone, ready to fight the entire world for her. But the fight was already lost. In his attempt to honor her, he had damned her, and worse. She realized with a dawning, sickening horror. She had allowed him to pull her son down with them. The kiss on her hand had not been a promise of salvation. It had been a sentence, and her child would now have to serve it, too. The town did not simply pass judgment. It cleaved itself in two. The gesture at the cemetery had been a stone cast into a still pond, and the ripples spread with alarming speed. The larger, louder faction, led by the pious indignation of women like Elspeth Miller, was openly hostile. They saw a blasphemous affair, a widow disrespecting her husband's memory with his own brother. Doors that had once been open to Clara were now firmly shut. Eyes that had once held pity now held a cold, hard righteousness. But there was another side, quieter and more cautious. It was comprised of people who lived on the fringes themselves, who knew that life in the West was too hard for simple, black-and-white morality. It was in the way the blacksmith, a man of few words, met Elijah's gaze in the street and gave a slow, deliberate nod of respect. It was in the small, anonymous sack of potatoes left in Clara's buckboard after a humiliating trip to the general store. It was in the weary eyes of the doctor's wife, who saw in Clara not a sinner, but a woman struggling to survive. They did not speak up in the court of public opinion, but their silent support was a small, flickering candle in a vast, encroaching darkness. The public consequences, however, were swift and brutal. The very next day, Martha Gable met Clara at the door of the bakery, her arms crossed, her face a mask of stern disapproval. "I'm sorry, Clara," she said, the words devoid of any actual sorrow. "I can't have you working here anymore. It's not proper. It's bad for business." She was fired, cast out from one of the few places that had offered her a semblance of independence. Later that week, when she tried to buy seed corn from the mercantile, The proprietor suddenly found himself too busy to serve her, turning his back to count inventory that had already been counted twice. She was being systematically erased from the town's economic life. Starved out. Lucas, true to his word, had moved his fight to a new front. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary posture suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, rode out to the farm. He found Elijah reinforcing the corral, his movements economical and precise. "Elijah," the sheriff said, staying on his horse. "Gotta have a word." Elijah stopped his work, leaning on a post, his expression unreadable. "Sheriff, got a formal complaint lodged against you. From Lucas Kane." The sheriff pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "Says you're causing a public disturbance and harassing the widow. Clara Hale." A muscle tightened in Elijah's jaw. "Is that what he's calling it?" "He says you're an unwelcome presence, that you're taking advantage of a grieving woman, turning the town against her with your flagrant behavior." Sheriff Brody had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Look, son, I don't much care for the he said, she said of it all. But a complaint is a complaint. I'm telling you as a courtesy, watch your step. Lucas has friends in this town. He's painting a picture of you as a predator and her as your victim. Don't give him any more paint." The threat was clear. Lucas was using the law as a weapon, twisting Elijah's protection into a narrative of persecution. The poison of the town's judgment inevitably seeped into the one place Clara had tried to keep sacred, her son's world. Ben stopped talking about school. He would come home with his head down, a new rip in his shirt, or a bruise darkening on his cheekbone that he would refuse to explain. The taunts from the cemetery had followed him into the schoolyard. He was the boy with the sinful mother, the son of a dead man and the nephew of a devil. One afternoon, he didn't come home at all. The sun began to dip low, and the long shadows of the mountains began to creep across the valley. A cold, primal panic seized Clara. She ran to the schoolhouse, only to find it empty. She screamed his name until her throat was raw, her voice swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Elijah found her circling the cabin like a caged animal, her face pale with terror. "Where would he go?" he asked, his voice calm and steady, a rock in her sea of panic. I don't know, she sobbed. Think, Clara, a place he felt safe, a place that was his father's. Her mind, frantic and disordered, suddenly focused. "The oak tree," she whispered. "Down by the creek. Thomas built a small lean-to there. He used to take Ben. They would call it their fort." Without another word, Elijah was on his horse, riding hard as Clara followed on foot, stumbling through the sagebrush, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. They found him there, at the base of a sprawling, ancient oak tree. A small, crude shelter made of fallen branches and old canvas leaned against its trunk. Ben was curled up inside, fast asleep, his face tear-streaked but peaceful, his small hand clutching the wooden horse Elijah had carved for him. The relief was so absolute, so overwhelming, that Clara's knees gave way. Elijah dismounted and knelt beside the boy, gently brushing the hair from his forehead. Ben's eyes fluttered open, not with fear, but with a quiet recognition. He looked at the man kneeling over him, the man who had taught him to ride, who had protected his mother, who was strong and quiet and kind. In the hushed twilight of the woods, Ben's small voice was startlingly clear. "I wish you were my PA." The words, spoken with the pure, uncomplicated honesty of a child, shattered what little composure Clara had left. It was the deepest wish of her own secret, traitorous heart, voiced by the one person she had tried so desperately to shield from it all. It was too much. The shunning, the poverty, the threats, and now the beautiful, terrible innocence of her son's pain. It all came crashing down on her. A great shuddering sob escaped her, and she collapsed, her strength utterly gone. Elijah was there before she hit the ground. He scooped her up, his arms a familiar circle of strength, and held her as she wept, her body shaking with a grief so profound it seemed to have no end. He carried her back to the homestead, with Ben walking silently beside them, his small hand holding onto the back of Elijah's coat. That night, after she had cried herself into a fragile, exhausted sleep, Elijah made his decision. He stood on the porch, looking out at the moon-drenched landscape, and he saw the truth with brutal clarity. He had come here to find justice for his brother, but he had only brought misery to his brother's family. He was the source of the talk, the target of Lucas's hate, the reason Ben was being tormented. His presence, meant to be a shield, had become a lightning rod, drawing all the fire and fury of the world down upon Clara's head. To protect her, he had to disappear. Before the sun rose, he packed his saddlebags. He approached Clara's bedroom door and stood for a long moment, listening to the sound of her steady breathing. Then, he went back to the main room. From a hidden pocket in his saddlebag, he pulled a worn, oilskin packet. He found Clara sitting at the table, awake, a pre-dawn chill in the air. She had known. The set of his jaw, the finality in his eyes last night. She had known this was coming. "You're leaving," she said. It was not a question. "It's the only way," he said, his voice rough. "As long as I'm here, he'll use me to hurt you and the boy. When I'm gone, the talk will die down. He'll have no reason—" Her heart cried out in protest, but her mind knew he was right. She could only nod, a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. "I'm not leaving you with nothing," he said. He placed the oilskin packet on the table between them. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. "I didn't just talk to Jedediah. I went to the county records office. I found the man who rode with Lucas before he came here. I paid him for the truth." She looked at the packet, confused. "Thomas's land," Elijah explained, his voice hard as iron. "The deed was in his name, but the water rights to the creek were on a separate claim, a claim that Lucas knew was about to expire. He forged a letter, a fake offer for a huge tract of land up north. He lured Thomas out on that hunt, to a piece of territory he knew was unstable, hoping for an accident. His plan was to let the water claim expire, then buy it himself for pennies. With the water rights, this land is worthless. He meant to choke you out, to force you to sell to him for nothing." Inside the packet were letters, a sworn statement from the man Lucas had hired, and a copy of the original water claim document. It was the whole sordid story. It was the truth. "It's proof, Clara," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "It's enough to see him hang." He stood up, his movement stiff. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the latch. He looked at her one last time, his face a mask of anguish. Then he was gone. Clara sat alone in the silent cabin as the sun began to rise, the cold, heavy weight of the truth resting on the table before her. Elijah was gone. She was alone again. But this time, she was not just a victim. This time, she was armed. For 2 days, the oilskin packet sat on Clara's table, a heavy, tangible representation of the truth. It was a weapon, and holding it filled her with a terrifying, unfamiliar strength. The fear was still there. A cold snake coiled in her gut, but now it was mixed with a simmering rage. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was the keeper of her husband's last story, and she would not let it be buried in a lie. With a resolve that felt as brittle and sharp as new ice, she saddled the old mare and rode not to town, but towards Lucas's sprawling ranch. She found him supervising 2 ranch hands as they branded calves. The air was thick with the smell of scorched hair and animal fear. He saw her approach, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. He dismissed his men with a wave of his hand, clearly assuming she had come to surrender. "Knew you'd come around. Clara," he said, his voice oozing a false sympathy. "It's a hard world for a woman alone. Did you come to accept my offer?" "I came to give you one of my own," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. From her saddlebag, she pulled the packet. She didn't hand it to him, just held it up. "Leave this valley. Lucas, leave us be, and I will not take this to the sheriff." He squinted at the packet, his curiosity piqued. "What's that? Some love letter from your runaway beau?" "It's a sworn statement," she said, her voice gaining strength. "From a man in Laredo. A man you paid to forge a letter to my husband. It's the original water claim for this property. The one you planned to steal. It's proof, Lucas, proof of what you did to Thomas." For the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine shock in his eyes. He reached for the packet, but she held it back. His shock quickly curdled into a sneer, but it was thinner now, less confident. "You're bluffing. A woman's hysterics." "Am I?" She opened the flap and pulled out the top document, the sworn statement. She held it so he could see the official notary seal at the bottom. He stared at it, and the color drained from his face. He lunged, not with the grace of Elijah, but with the clumsy force of a brute, and snatched the papers from her hand before she could react. He scanned them quickly, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. The proof was undeniable. The careful, patient web of his deceit was laid bare on those pages. Clara's heart soared for a moment. She had him. He was caught. And then he laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a harsh, guttural bark that held no humor, only contempt. "Proof!" he spat. He walked over to the branding fire, where the irons glowed a malevolent orange in their bed of coals. "You think this matters? You think anyone will believe the word of a fallen woman over mine?" And with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the entire packet, the letters, the claim, the confession, into the heart of the fire. "No!" Clara cried, a strangled sound of despair. The papers curled, blackened, and were consumed by the flames in an instant. The ink that held Elijah's hope, the words that held Thomas's justice, turned to weightless black ash that floated up into the uncaring blue sky. It was all gone. Lucas turned back to her, his smile a terrifying slash in his face. "There," he said. "Now it's your word against mine. Who do you think Sheriff Brody will believe? Now, get off my land before I have you thrown off." She rode home in a daze, the ashes of her hope scattering on the wind behind her. He had not just destroyed the evidence. He had destroyed her, as if the heavens themselves were conspiring with him. The rain stopped. The summer sun, which had been a source of life, became an instrument of torture. The sky turned a hard, metallic blue, and the heat became a physical weight, pressing down on the land, cracking the earth into a mosaic of thirsty fissures. The creek slowed to a muddy trickle, and then, one morning, the new well Elijah had dug gave up only a bucket of sludge before running dry. The drought had come. Clara's world shrank to a desperate, daily search for water. Her small vegetable patch withered and died. The chickens grew listless. The old mare's ribs began to show. Elijah was gone. The small flicker of community support she'd had was extinguished by Lucas. He passed the word through town. Anyone who sold water to the widow Hale, anyone who gave her credit, anyone who offered her work, would find their own wells running dry, their own credit cut off. He was the biggest rancher in the county, a man people feared to cross. One by one, the doors were barred to her. She was an island, and the tide was going out. Desperation became a constant, gnawing companion. One evening, as she looked at Ben's thin face in the gloom of the cabin, she finally broke. There was nothing left here but dust and ghosts and the slow, grinding certainty of starvation. She pulled out an old burlap sack and began to pack. A change of clothes for Ben, the family Bible, the small tintype photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. Her movements were stiff, robotic. She would take the boy and walk. North, east, it didn't matter. Anywhere but here. Ben came and stood in the doorway of his small room, watching her. "What are you doing, Mama?" We're going on a trip, sweetheart," she said, her voice cracking, unable to meet his eyes. He was silent for a long moment. "Are we coming back?" The question hung in the air. "I don't know," she whispered, the truth a bitter pill. "I don't want to go," he said, his small voice firm. He walked to the window and placed his hand on the rough wooden frame. "Pa built this house. He cut these logs. He told me." He looked back at her, his eyes, so like his father's, holding a depth of understanding that belied his age. "This is our home. This is his home." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. In her despair, she had been ready to run, to abandon the very thing Thomas had worked and died for. She had been focused on her own survival. But Ben was fighting for his father's legacy. He would not let it be erased by drought or by the cruelty of a wicked man. A fierce, protective love, stronger than any fear, surged through her. He was right. They could not run. To run would be to let Lucas win, to let Thomas's memory be turned to dust and blown away. She knelt and pulled her son into a fierce hug, burying her face in his hair. "You're right," she whispered. "You're right. We're not going anywhere." A new resolve, harder and colder than before, settled in her heart. Lucas had burned the papers. He thought he had burned all the proof, but he was wrong. She went to the small wooden chest where she kept her few treasures. From beneath her wedding veil, she pulled out a small, leather-bound book, Thomas's journal. He had not been a man of many words, but he had kept it dutifully. She flipped through the sparse entries until she found the last one, written the morning of the hunt. "Lucas came by. Strange talk of a big herd north of the canyon. Says we should ride out today. Something feels off. He's too eager." It wasn't a confession, not on its own, but at the bottom of the page, there was a small, dark, reddish-brown smear. Thomas had cut his thumb mending a bridle that morning, and a single drop of his blood had stained the page. It was the last thing he ever wrote, marked with his own lifeblood. Clara tore the page from the journal. This was all she had left. It was a ghost's whisper against a liar's shout, but it was the truth. The next morning, she walked into town. She did not scurry or hide her face. She walked down the center of the dusty street, her back straight, her head held high, the diary page clutched in her hand. People stopped and stared, whispering as she passed. She ignored them all, her eyes fixed on the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody looked up from his paperwork as she entered, his expression weary. "Clara, I hope you're not here to cause more trouble." "I'm here to file a complaint," she said, her voice clear and strong. "A formal accusation against Lucas Kane for the murder of my husband, Thomas Hale." The sheriff sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Clara, we've been over this. It was an accident. You have no proof." "He burned the proof," she said, "but he didn't get all of it." She laid the single and blood-stained page on the desk in front of him. "This was the last thing my husband ever wrote. Read it." Brody picked up the page, his skepticism plain. He read the words, his brow furrowed. He looked at the date. Then he looked at the bloodstain. He held it up to the light, his expression slowly changing. It was thin. Yes, circumstantial. But it was tangible. It was a seed of doubt planted in the official story. He looked from the page to Clara's face, at the unyielding determination in her eyes. This was not the hysterical woman Lucas had described. This was a woman who would not be silenced. "I'm officially reopening the investigation into the death of Thomas Hale," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the trouble he knew was coming. "I'll be questioning everyone who was on that hunt, including Lucas." The news hit the town like a thunderclap. The quiet feud had just become a public war. As Clara stepped out of the sheriff's office and into the harsh sunlight, she felt the entire town watching her. She had just set a match to a powder keg. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel afraid, only a grim sense of purpose. Her gaze drifted up, towards the distant, sun-baked ridges that overlooked the valley. And there, almost a mirage in the shimmering heat, she saw him, a lone rider on a black horse, watching. Elijah. He had never left. He had been her silent, unseen guardian all along. The preliminary hearing was held not in a grand courthouse, but in the town's largest meeting hall. A stuffy, wood-paneled room that smelled of stale tobacco and anxious sweat. The entire town seemed to be crammed inside, lining the walls and filling the benches, their faces a tense tapestry of morbid curiosity, suspicion, and allegiance. The air was thick and heavy, charged with the impending collision of a private tragedy and public justice. Lucas sat beside his lawyer, a slick man from a bigger town, looking for all the world like a wronged pillar of the community. He was dressed in his Sunday best, his face set in a mask of dignified indignation, occasionally shaking his head in sorrowful disbelief. He denied everything. The accusations were, his lawyer argued, the fantastical ravings of a grieving, hysterical widow, manipulated by the sudden and unwelcome appearance of a drifter, her husband's estranged brother. The death of Thomas Hale was a tragic accident, plain and simple. To suggest otherwise was to slander the name of a good man and heap further suffering upon his cousin, Lucas, who had done nothing but offer Christian charity and support. But Sheriff Brody, methodical and grim, began to patiently dismantle the lie. He was not a brilliant man, but he was a stubborn one, and Clara's quiet determination had lit a fire in his weary soul. He first called Jedediah, the hunter. The man was sober for the first time in what seemed like years, his hands trembling as he took the oath. He spoke in a low, halting voice, recounting the details of the hunt. He told the circuit judge about the strange nervousness of the other men, and about the lone rider on the ridge. "And who did you find when you reached Thomas Hale's body?" Sheriff Brody asked, his voice echoing in the silent room. Jedediah swallowed hard, refusing to look at Lucas. "He was there first," the hunter mumbled. "Lucas Kane. He was just standing over him. He told us he'd just arrived himself, told us what to say had happened." The lawyer was on his feet in an instant, objecting, badgering Jedediah about his drinking, his unreliable memory. But the seed had been planted. The official story had a crack in it. Then, Elijah was called. He walked to the stand with a quiet, dangerous grace. He did not look at Lucas. He looked only at the judge. He spoke calmly and factually, his voice a low, steady current in the turbulent room. He laid out the results of his investigation with cold precision: the expiring water claim, the land's sudden worthlessness without it, Lucas's deep financial troubles. He presented the sworn statement from the forger in Laredo, a copy he had wisely made and sent by post before giving the original to Clara. It detailed the payment he'd received from Lucas to create the fake land offer that had lured Thomas north. "This was never about a buffalo hunt," Elijah concluded, his voice ringing with conviction. "It was about a piece of paper. It was about greed. Lucas Kane sent my brother to his death so he could steal his son's inheritance." Lucas erupted, shouting that it was all lies, that Elijah was a drifter and a vagrant trying to worm his way into his brother's family, into his brother's wife's bed. The judge slammed his gavel, his face a thundercloud, and the hall fell silent again. The tension stretched to a breaking point. Sheriff Brody held up the final piece of physical evidence. "This is the last page from the Journal of Thomas Hale," he announced, his voice solemn, dated the morning of his death. He read the entry aloud, his plain voice giving the words a terrible weight. "Lucas came by. Strange talk of a big herd north of the canyon. Says we should ride out today. Something feels off. He's too eager." The sheriff paused, holding the page up for the judge to see. And at the bottom of the page, "Your Honor, is a stain confirmed by the doctor to be human blood." A collective gasp went through the room. The ghost of Thomas Hale had just spoken. "Finally," Sheriff Brody said. "I call Clara Hale to the stand." A path cleared for her as she walked forward, her worn and black dress a stark contrast to the dusty room. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Lucas. She sat, her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the judge, a man with tired, kind eyes. This was not a performance. This was a eulogy. "Mrs. Hale," her lawyer began gently, "can you tell us about the last time you saw your husband?" Clara's voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. "It was dawn," she began, her gaze becoming distant, seeing a memory instead of the faces before her. Lucas had just left. Thomas, he was troubled. He said it didn't feel right. He was a careful man. He knew the land. He said Lucas was pushing too hard, that there was a wildness in his eyes. She described their last moments together, painting a picture so vivid the entire room could see it. She spoke of how he had held Ben on his lap, promising him a new pony when he returned. She spoke of the way he'd checked the cinch on his saddle 3 times, a habit he had when he was uneasy. "He kissed me goodbye at the door," she said, her voice trembling, but never breaking. "He told me he loved me, and he said, if I'm not back by sundown, you send for the sheriff. Don't listen to anything Lucas tells you." Those were the last words he ever said to me. Tears were streaming down her face now, silent and unchecked. She was not just a widow reciting facts. She was a wife, sharing the last sacred moments of her husband's life. She was giving him the voice that Lucas had stolen. "My husband was a good and trusting man," she finished, her eyes finally finding Lucas's, and her gaze was not one of hate, but of profound, sorrowful judgment. And his cousin, his own blood, used that trust to lead him into a trap and left him to die alone in the dust. The hall was utterly still. The power of her grief, her love, her simple, unshakable truth had washed away all the lies and innuendo. There was no one in that room who did not believe her. The judge's verdict was swift. Lucas Kane was found guilty of manslaughter, of fabricating evidence, and of conspiracy to commit fraud. He was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. As the sentence was read, the mask of civility on Lucas's face finally shattered. His face contorted in a snarl of pure, animal rage, and he lunged towards the witness stand, towards Clara, screaming obscenities. Sheriff Brody and his deputy tackled him, wrestling him to the ground as he thrashed and cursed. He was dragged from the courtroom, a pathetic, defeated monster, his true nature revealed for all to see. The crowd poured out into the afternoon sun, dazed. Clara stood on the courthouse steps, Ben's hand clutching hers, feeling strangely numb. It was over. The fight was won. As she stood there, blinking in the bright light, Elijah came to her side. He didn't speak. He simply opened his arms, and she fell into them. He held her tightly, a brief, powerful embrace that was a release of all the fear, all the tension, all the grief of the past months. It was a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured. Then, just as quickly, he let her go. He took a small step back, his eyes full of a deep, aching tenderness, but his posture was one of respect. In this public space, in front of the town that had judged them so harshly, he was giving her back her honor. A few days later, the mail rider brought a letter. It was not addressed to Mrs. Thomas Hale, but simply to Clara. The handwriting was the shaky, elegant script of an old woman. It was from Abigail Hale, Thomas and Elijah's grandmother, a formidable matriarch who lived 2 counties away and who, Clara knew, had silently disapproved of their situation. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "My dearest Clara," it began, "a man from your town passed through and told me of the trial and of the truth of my grandson Thomas's passing. I am an old woman, set in my ways, and I confess that my heart was troubled by the whispers I had heard. I was wrong. It is clear that you are a woman of great strength and unimpeachable character. It is also clear that my grandson, Elijah, has inherited his grandfather's sense of honor. A man who defends the helpless and seeks justice for the dead is a good man. You have both endured a great trial and have proven the quality of your souls. You have my blessing. May you find peace in the home my grandson built." Clara read the letter 3 times. Tears of a new kind, tears of relief, blurring the words. It was an absolution she hadn't known she was so desperate for. That Sunday, when she and Ben walked into the general store, the proprietor, who had previously ignored her, met her gaze. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," he said, a look of genuine respect in his eyes. "Heard you might be needin' some seed corn. Got a new shipment in." The blacksmith nodded to her as she passed. A woman who had once whispered behind her back now offered a small, hesitant smile. The chill was beginning to thaw. The long, brutal winter of her isolation was finally beginning to end, and on the horizon, she could see the first fragile light of a new dawn. The trial did not magically wash the world clean, but it shifted the landscape. The drought of public opinion had broken, and now, a slow, tentative spring began to bloom. Life did not return to what it was, for that life was gone forever. Instead, a new life began to take root in the scarred earth. Elijah did not leave. He stayed, and the question of propriety, which had once seemed as vast and uncrossable as a canyon, now felt like a shallow creek they could simply step over. He moved his bedroll from the porch into the small, dusty room that had once been a storage space, and the cabin, which had felt so empty for so long, now felt full. Their days fell into a new rhythm, one of teamwork and shared purpose. A late summer windstorm, a final, spiteful lash from the season had torn a section of shingles from the cabin roof. In the past, it would have been a disaster for Clara, another impossible task on an endless list. Now, it was simply a chore. The three of them worked together under a warm autumn sun. Elijah was on the roof, his hammer striking a steady, reassuring beat that became the new heartbeat of the homestead. Ben, his small chest puffed out with importance, was the nail keeper, carefully handing them up to Elijah one by one. And Clara moved between the well and the ladder, bringing them water, her face shaded by a bonnet, a quiet smile playing on her lips. She watched them, her men, working to mend the home her first love had built. There was no conflict in the thought, no guilt, only a deep, quiet sense of continuity, of life refusing to be broken. The work was hard, their muscles ached, but at the end of the day, as they looked up at the solid, neatly patched roof, they shared a look of profound, weary satisfaction. They were not just mending a roof, they were rebuilding a life. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler. The evenings were spent by the hearth, the firelight casting a warm, gentle glow on their faces. The strained silences of the past were replaced by a comfortable quiet, punctuated by Ben's sleepy questions or the soft crackle of the fire. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer rattled their chains. Thomas's memory was a gentle presence now, a foundation upon which they were carefully, respectfully building something new. One evening, after Ben had been tucked into his bed, Clara and Elijah sat on the front porch steps, watching the last vestiges of purple and gold fade from the sky. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains and the dry, sweet smell of curing hay. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Elijah's voice, low and thoughtful, broke the stillness. "We could leave, you know." Clara turned to look at him. His face was in shadow, his profile a strong, dark shape against the deepening twilight. "Leave?" "Sell this place," he continued, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Go west, California, maybe. Or Oregon, somewhere no one knows our names. No one knows our story. We could be anyone, just a man and a woman and their boy, starting fresh." He was offering her an escape, a clean slate. He was offering to shield her forever from the whispers and the stares, from the memory of the trial and the weight of the past. It was a beautiful, generous offer, born from his deep, protective love for her. Clara was silent for a long moment. She thought of a new place, a green valley where the water always ran clear, a town where she was not the widow Hale, but just Clara. The thought was seductive, a cool drink of water to a soul that had been parched for so long. She could shed her old skin, leave the grief and the scandal behind like a snake's sheddings in the dust. But then she looked at the cabin, its newly patched roof a dark silhouette against the stars. She thought of the new well, its water cool and sweet. She thought of Ben, asleep inside, who had refused to leave the home his father had built. She had spent 3 years surviving, running from her own feelings, hiding from the judgment of others. The trial had forced her to stand still and fight. And in fighting, she had found something she thought she had lost forever: herself. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. "I don't want to run. Elijah," she said, her voice soft but filled with a strength she had never possessed before. "I'm tired of running. I'm tired of hiding." She turned to face him fully, her eyes clear and certain in the dim light. "I want to live, right here." It was not a rejection of his offer, but an acceptance of their life. It was a declaration that this place, this complicated, scarred, beautiful piece of land, was her home. And he was her home. A slow smile spread across Elijah's face, reaching his eyes and filling them with a light that outshone the rising stars. He had offered her an escape, but she had chosen a life, and she had chosen it with him. From that day on, a quiet, unspoken understanding settled between them. They were a family. It needed no ceremony, no pronouncement from a preacher. It was a truth as solid and real as the mountains that watched over them. They worked, they ate, they talked, and sometimes they laughed. Ben's laughter, once a rare and precious sound, became a common music in the small cabin. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of glory, painting the entire valley in shades of crimson and gold, they were all on the porch together. Ben was showing Elijah the finer points of a new knot he had learned, his small face serious with concentration. Clara was mending a tear in the boy's shirt, her needle moving in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Elijah listened patiently to Ben's explanation, and then he turned to Clara. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took her hand, the one holding the needle. He gently took the sewing from her fingers and set it aside. Then, just as he had done in the cemetery, he knelt before her. The gesture was the same, but the world was different. There were no gawking crowds, no whispers of condemnation. There was only the vast, quiet beauty of the land and the soft evening air. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, a soft, lingering touch that was a world away from the desperate, defiant act at the graveside. That kiss had been a challenge. This was a vow. Clara looked down at the dark head bowed before her, and a tear slipped from her eye. But this time, it was a tear of pure, unadulterated joy. Beside them, Ben, seeing the quiet, profound love that flowed between them, simply smiled. The story closes not on a single moment, but on a journey, on a bright, wind-swept afternoon. 3 figures on horseback ride across a wide, golden plain. A man, a woman, and a boy, their silhouettes sharp against the endless sky. In the distance, the wild, lonely cry of a coyote echoes across the land. But they do not flinch. They do not look over their shoulders. They are not afraid of the wildness anymore, for they have found their own peace within it. They ride on together, towards the setting sun, a new family, finally home. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so drop a comment down below and let's connect. If you enjoyed the tale, please consider subscribing to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts with our community of fellow adventurers.